And, you criticized, and I have to say, I share the criticism, President Obama, for not wrapping his arms around Simpson-Bowles. Well, I'm afraid the record will show that Governor Romney not only didn't do that, but did just the opposite by rejecting the predicate of Simpson-Bowles, namely that you had to do both. So how do we move forward?
No, but I think Romney's been pretty, look, the primaries are primaries, and Obama said things he wished he could have back in the 07, 08 primaries as well. But, and I wasn't a huge fan of Romney in the primaries, but partly because I thought it showed a certain, I don't know what it was exactly, lack of political deftness or just a willingness to pander in a way that when he did things like that. Of course, everyone else was as well, and it happens in democratic politics, or I guess in all politics. But I would say he's been pretty clear in the general election that he will accept, he's not worried about overall tax revenues increasing. He does not want to increase tax rates, which Simpson-Bowles doesn't either. He wants to broaden the base, and we have to have an argument about which deductions and whether the Feldstein idea of just having a general cap on deductions gets you enough money and all that. But the truth is, the Feldstein idea, which Romney, I think, now is pretty close to endorsing, which is, just to explain, so that's an overall cap on the deductions you could claim, as opposed to getting rid of particular deductions. You could get rid of some of them, but getting rid of mortgage interest deduction or state and local tax deduction, or the ones that are or philanthropic contribution deductions, you could claim $25,000 and no more. That is actually a very, from a progressive point of view or redistributionist point of view, a progressive tax code point of view, a very good liberal proposal, because it really clobbers the wealthy. Most middle-class people do not claim $25,000 of deductions, so they'll just claim everything they now claim. The people who will pay a higher effective tax rate, though not a higher marginal tax rate, will be the wealthy, and Romney's put that on the table. So I think there's enough common room. I mean, tax rates has become, for better or worse, a kind of, iconic thing in the Republican Party. I don't think that's going to break if Romney wins, but I think you could end up in a Reagan-esque way with more tax revenues and with a perfectly reasonable budget deal.
Look, I mean, from your lips to God's ears,
he's got that connection.
Right. Unlike some of my fellow Democrats, for me, the tax rates are not the shibboleth. Here's what I'm interested in, and I think what we all ought to be interested in. We need a tax code that, number one, promotes growth, right? We do not have a pro-growth tax code. Number two, passes some rough and ready tests of fairness, including what's known as horizontal equity, where similarly situated people are treated the same as opposed to differently. And third, and this is where we may part company, in current circumstances, we need a tax code that, with a static analysis, also raises additional revenues. And if Governor, and so I don't begrudge him the idea of making sure that the top rates don't go up and broadening the base. I mean, we can work with that model. The question is he prepared to broaden the base enough under that scenario to raise real money to put up against the spending cuts that are also necessary?
I mean, I can't speak for him, thank God.
Oh, please do.
No, I'm sure he'd be thrilled to have me. Yeah. I would just say this, look, as you know, I mean, you can raise some revenue by raising tax rates or changing the tax code, obviously, to just get more revenues. But the main way you really get more revenues is with economic growth. And I would say, whatever you think of Romney, I'm not sure all of his ideas of how to get economic growth are correct, but that is what he wants. I mean, this is his main calling card. He's a businessman. He's going to get the country going again in terms of jobs, growth, and everything else. And I think he's serious about that. I actually think he will have a slightly Franklin Rooseveltian attitude towards that, which is he will be somewhat experimental, and we'll look around and see, are the main problems regulatory, are they tax policy, are there are a million other things they could be, and adjust them accordingly. And I've got to say, really, and I mean, I try to avoid too many of the easy conservative talking points about President Obama, but I'm a little struck. He really doesn't seem to spend a lot of time thinking about or evaluating policies by the standard of, will it produce economic growth? He has many other concerns. He's a big environmentalist, so he has to, he's very worried about too much oil and gas and coal, and very big on the solar stuff, and he's got all these distributional concerns, equity concerns about the tax code. And when you get through all these other concerns that seem to people, that drive his administration, I do think he sort of assumes that the private sector will take care of itself, and you don't have to have a government that really is thinking about how to structure many different federal policies to encourage economic growth. Maybe I'm not making a psychological argument, but I just think if you step back and look and say, was this a guy who came in like Franklin Roosevelt and thought, I'm not even sure what works, and in retrospect, some of FDR's things didn't work probably, but nonetheless, what I'm going to do is get this country going again, and I'm just going to keep trying until I figure out how people get back to work and how the country gets back on its feet. That really hasn't been, I would say, I just don't think that's been characteristic of him in the first term.
Well, this would be a long discussion. I think that the first 2 years were conducted under the aegis of necessity. There were crises to be addressed. There was a genuine chance that the global financial system would actually collapse, and instead of a great recession, we would have the second Great Depression. And so I think he spent most of his first 2 years in office trying everything he could to ward off the worst case outcome. And I will never be able to prove, nor will anyone else, that but for what he did, that worst case outcome would have come to pass. But it is a fact that it didn't, and I think it's also a fact that it could have.
I mean, I think that's what you would have done, but I think what the real existing Obama administration did is spend most of his first 2 years fighting for Obamacare, which had nothing to do with the financial crisis, and it doesn't do anything good for economic growth. We can debate how much bad it might do in terms of uncertainty and regulations and healthcare costs and the like. That was really, I mean, the stimulus, I agree. I mean, we can all argue about that, but that, you got to say, that was part, I mean, TARP was the main thing that saved the financial system. That was already pretty well saved when he took over, I would say. But you could have argued that if you didn't have a huge stimulus, we would have really stayed in a very deep recession and maybe heading to a depression, which would have been disastrous. That's a big argument. But the stimulus, I think he made a tactical mistake by not trying harder to get Republican votes, which I think the Republican Party, reeling after '08, could have been pried open more by Obama with different tactics. But again, that's just a tactical thing. But to go to Obamacare, really, and then what did he pass? So Obamacare was the next year and a half, basically. In between, the Democratic House passed 2 measures, or brought up 2 measures, passed one, cap and trade, which, again, whatever you think of it, isn't a pro-growth measure, and card check, which they kind of kept. I think did the House pass it? I can't remember.
I don't think so.
But they talked about it, and then they fell short in the Senate. They couldn't get 60 votes for it, which, again, whatever you think of the merits of labor unions and having a different way to elect to decide whether you want a union in your workplace, wouldn't normally be characterized as a pro-growth measure. So I think it was kind of crazy, honestly. If he had done what FDR did, which is come in, if he had gone right to the financial reform agenda, and I don't know enough to know exactly what version of Dodd-Frank or non-Dodd-Frank he should have done. I think he would have gotten a lot of Republican support. I think he would have, politically, it would have been much more intelligent. And it's revealing, though, that he thought the thing to do in the midst, as you say, of a huge financial crisis and a big economic recession, that the thing to do was overhaul the healthcare system.
Well, look, Bill, given the fact that I'm on the record, having made that same argument, as you know, with regard to both the Affordable Care Act and cap and trade, I'm not going to disgrace myself by, disagreeing with you and myself. I mean, that would be, that would be silly. But given the fact, that partisan fissures had already reopened around the stimulus bill, it's not clear to me that if he had done what I would have counseled him to do in the order that I would have counseled him to do it, that the results would have been fundamentally different. Could I raise just one more point?
Can I just make one little point on this? I mean, and this isn't, this is sort of interesting political science and historical exercise. It wouldn't really affect, if you believe in the liberal policies, you should still vote for Obama, and if you don't, you shouldn't. But I would say this, I think foreign policy is sort of a little case study that suggests there was more opportunity for bipartisanship if President Obama had been skillful. Because in fact, in foreign policy, as you stressed, he kept Gates and he appointed Hillary Clinton and, put Petraeus in charge of Afghanistan. And he had, for all the bitterness of the last 4 years, he's had pretty consistent more or less bipartisan support. In fact, on Afghanistan, more Republican support on most of the big foreign policy issues. I mean, Guantanamo was the flashpoint, and he backed off on that. But so I think, in a way, again, when people look back at the Obama administration after 4 years, I hope, maybe after 8, they will be puzzled why in foreign policy he decided to be so centrist, and in domestic policy he decided to sort of simply, I would argue, let Nancy Pelosi kind of run wild. I mean, I do think the degree of pent-up demand in the Democratic Party, I mean, this I think is just an analytical point, and again, not one that you would have been on the side, I think, of resisting the pent-up demand, but remember, the Democratic Party in 2008 had been, for 28 years, either had not controlled the White House or had not controlled Congress, except for the 2 years of 93, 94, where they did control both and passed the big budget, but then got messed up on health care. So I think the number of Democratic constituencies who felt it had been a generation since they could get their favorite domestic programs bulked up, which is what the stimulus basically did, huge increases in domestic discretionary spending, and then also get health care passed, which had been a longstanding, obviously, part of the Democratic agenda. The degree to which Obama didn't shape that and just sort of rode that tiger, I think will end up being judged by historians and political scientists to have been a mistake.
Well, one of my duties in the first 6 months of 1993 was to take Clinton's austerity budget around to all of those groups. Yeah. The scars on my back, I think, will never quite heal. Some of them forgiven me. Let me just raise one other question, because you've emphasized more than once the gap between the real existing Obama, and some idealized depiction of it, allegedly mine. And I think it's fair to turn the tables just a little bit, because, obviously there's not as much actual evidence in the case of Mitt Romney as there now is in the case of Barack Obama. But there is, it seems to me, a identifiable stable now of conservative reform policy people and intellectuals, many of whom have clustered around this new journal, Yuval Levin's journal, the National Affairs, I think it's called.
An AU alum.
Right, and a journal that I read, with profit and admiration, even when, as is frequently though not always the case, I fundamentally disagree with the argument it's making. If Governor Romney is at heart a conservative reformer, he has had multiple opportunities, because I'm reliably told that he's been in regular contact with that entire coterie, which is to the Republican Party, roughly speaking at this point, what the DLC and the Progressive Policy Institute were for the Democratic Party during those years. They appear to me to have had no appreciable impact on his agenda. Have I missed something?
I hope so. No, I think that's not fair. I mean, he did pick Paul Ryan as his running mate, and no, and I think on education policy and other, I mean, he hasn't developed these things in as much detail as Clinton did in '92. I mean, Clinton had been thinking about this stuff a long time and had a better developed, I would say, coterie of advisors. I think here's one complexity on the Republican side, which I think doesn't make it analogous to the Democratic side. I mean, Bill was very involved in the new Democratic agenda and institutions and that helped Bill Clinton, that Bill Clinton was very much part of as governor. And I agree Romney hasn't been part of it in nearly the same way. Maybe it's just a different type of person, lets the staff guys do that. And I think the people he would appoint, I mean, Mike Leavitt, the former governor of Utah, who I imagine would be Romney's chief of staff, and maybe Glenn Hubbard, who I think has written for National Affairs, who I imagine might be Secretary of the Treasury. I think it would be a pretty reformist conservative administration. I think the complexity is, in the Republican Party is, are people like me and Yuval and all of us, are we more, and in the Democratic Party, it was clear that the new Democrats were moving the party back to the center, Democratic Leadership Council, et cetera. It's not clear to me, I don't know, are we more conservative or more moderate than the establishment Republicans? We're sort of some of both, actually, and we're both more, we want to make bigger changes than certainly Bush wanted to make, or than a lot of the sort of establishment types want to make, but we also would like to make them understanding the nature of the modern world in a forward-looking way. So I think it makes it more complicated, maybe, and I haven't really thought this through, to sort of know how to politically implement that agenda. I mean, is Chris Christie or is Mitch Daniels a more moderate governor of Indiana than his Republican predecessors who were governor of Indiana, or more conservative? Well, he's in some ways both, right? I mean, or I'd say he's more conservative but more reformist. And I think that would be the best case for Romney. Look, I take the point that he has not been associated with that agenda and those people in the way that Bill Clinton certainly was on the Democratic side. And I would simply say that, but I still think that's the main agenda on offer. I mean, I don't think he's going to be a hard right, just say no to everything president. You can't be president and do that. I don't think, however, he's going to simply be a sort of 70s, 80s moderate Republican there to preside over the kind of current federal government, mostly because of necessity, as you said earlier on. I mean, we've got $1 trillion deficit, so something has to be done. So I think almost willy-nilly, or, just because of the way things are, he'll end up somewhere close to that kind of agenda.
Well, I think we can agree then that in Governor Romney's case, were he to be elected president, to an unusually significant degree, personnel would be policy. And one could, and his selection, his first selections will be a pretty solid leading indicator as to whether you're more right than wrong, or vice versa.
With that, let's open it up to questions from the floor. We've got 2 microphones, one on each side. I'll ask people to come down. Bill Galston has to drive to Charlottesville this evening still. So we'll see if we can wrap it up around 9:45 and let him get going. But in any case, we'll stop at 10 promptly.
Bill just goes from one distinguished institution of higher education to the next,
Okay, so we'll ask you to just identify yourself and be brief.
Hi, my name is Isabel Rodriguez. First of all, thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Professor Levine, for hosting this. I guess my question has to do with women. So the vote of the women is very critical in this election, and I guess my question is, what do you believe your candidate is doing to appeal to this voting bloc, and who do you think ultimately will take the majority vote for them?
Your candidate's doing where to appeal to it.
Well, I think it's, I think in President Obama's case, it's been pretty straightforward. He has hit the issue of equal pay in the workplace very hard. He leads off with what was in fact his first act as President of the United States, signing the Lilly Ledbetter Act. And he is also, I think, fairly skillfully exploited some of the excesses of Republican rhetoric and Republican policy in this area. I think a lot of women, whatever they may think on the abortion issue, were sort of stunned to hear, or at least to think that they were hearing, a relitigation of contraception. And we can have a long discussion as to whether that was what the debate was about. But I think that from a simple political standpoint, that was not the Republican Party's finest hour. And the fact now that 2 Senate candidates, have said some fairly strange and to many people quite distressing things about rape, I think has, it affects the Republican brand, and the president and his team have not been shy about pointing that out.
Well, certainly politically, it's a huge part of President Obama's, been a huge part of the campaign, and it seems like it's going to be a big part of the close of the campaign. I mean, I think it's mostly, the war on women rhetoric is so overheated and just false that I don't quite know where to begin to, if you're pro-life, you're not anti-women. A lot of women are pro-life, and that doesn't mean that what Aiken said in Missouri is defensible, and Romney immediately denounced it, and Aiken apologized for it. The Lilly Ledbetter Act, that is an example, though, of just politics is all about exaggerating and about pretending that little issues are big issues. It is against the law. It was against the law when George Bush was president. It was against the law when Bill Clinton was president to discriminate on the grounds of gender. I can't pay someone less because she's a woman who works at the Weekly Standard if she's equally qualified as a man. What Lilly Ledbetter did was a minor change in a badly drafted congressional law that had to do with the statute of limitations, I guess, if that's the right term, legally, for when you could bring a lawsuit if you thought you had been discriminated against. I think the number of people who've actually filed lawsuits or sought redress under Lilly Ledbetter is extremely tiny number of people in this country, and the idea that this proves that he's on the side of women, I really don't buy that. So, and I slightly, I'll be even a little tougher, I slightly hold against Obama the kind of demagoguing on women, because it really isn't healthy for the country. If he wants to make the case for Roe v. Wade, or make the case for abortion rights, or make the case for his HHS regulation requiring, Catholic University to pay for in its health insurance contraception, he should make that case, but he shouldn't pretend that to oppose that is to be anti-women. Let's go over here.
Hi, first of all, thank you for coming out. My name is Mike. I'm a senior in SBA. The question I have has to do with the Republican field in the primary for 2012. I would like to make the statement that it was relatively weaker than primary fields that we've seen in the past. However, conservative columnists have made the point time and time again that this is one of the rare opportunities where the Republican base is really anti the Democratic incumbent, and there was a lot of fever to get Obama out of the White House. With that being said, if the enthusiasm amongst the Republican base was so strong this year, why didn't we see credible candidates like Mr. Kristol stated, like like Mitch Daniels, Bobby Jindal, Jeb Bush? Why didn't we see them enter the race?
I mean, I honestly think it was a bunch of individual considerations. I mean, I know that's the case with Jeb Bush, and I think with Mitch Daniels it was family, and Christie really thought you should wait to be governor for a whole term before running, and maybe they all made some political considerations. Obama looked a little stronger in late 2011. I don't think it had much to do with the Republican base, those guys would have been beloved by a lot of the Republican primary electorate. So I just think it was bad luck in a way that Republicans ended up with a weak field. In a year where I agree you might have expected an awful lot of ambitious people to run. People talk themselves into waiting for the right time. I give Obama a huge amount of credit for not listening to all the political pros who told him, are you crazy taking on Hillary Clinton? You'll destroy the most promising political career in America. Just bide your time in the Senate, get reelected in a landslide in Illinois in 2010. You'll be a prohibitive favorite for when Hillary either finishes her term or for 2012 if the Republicans would have won, if McCain would have won in 2008. And he's ignored them all and just ran for president when he had been a senator for, 2.5 years. So I give him a lot of credit for that, and I'm disappointed that Republicans don't have as much, seeming quite as much self-confidence as President Obama.
Yeah, well, let me deepen the mystery by comparing 2012 to 1992. Now, rather 1991, because that's
Primary.
The real comparison is 2011 and 1991. George H.W. Bush was the triumphant victor in the first Gulf War, and his approval ratings were sky high, and senior people in the Democratic Party, like for example Mario Cuomo, I think took a look at those numbers, asked themselves, what are my chances of overcoming this kind of presidential strength, and turned their back on the nomination, opening the door for a young and still relatively obscure governor from Arkansas to step forward. There was a famous episode where Cuomo had a plane warming up on the runway, prepared to carry him to New Hampshire to file. And he never got on the plane. Okay, by contrast, in 2011, here I disagree with Bill a little bit on the historical facts. If you look at the nadir of the Obama administration in the eyes of the American people, it came in September and October of 2011 after the debt ceiling fiasco. I know these numbers by heart. At exactly the time when all of the aspirants for the Republican presidential nomination were making up their minds, they ignored that reality. They ignored Bill Kristol, even more to the point. And, to a man and perhaps even a woman, they refused to step forward. And I think the mystery is a very deep one, frankly.
Here's just a 2-minute political science point, if I can make it. So who are the last presidents of the United States? Let's just think about how well qualified they were to be president. Obama, we've discussed. George W. Bush, did nothing much in his adult life until he was sort of owner of the Rangers. Then he runs for governor of Texas, runs a good campaign in '94, reelected in a walk in '98 in a pretty easy state for a Republican at that point, and decides, he's ready to run. Karl Rove got the donors lined up. They muscle everyone else out of the way, and he beats McCain, kind of closer race than Bush expected in 2000s. Before Bush is Clinton. Bill just said Clinton ran in a year when a lot of other people backed off. Before Clinton is George H.W. Bush, who we think of as, well, he was really been around forever and a long. But when did he run for? He ran for president in 1980, having been a two-term congressman, I guess. One-term congressman, once or twice defeated Senate candidate in Texas, a second-tier cabinet official under Ford, and not particularly successful, RNC chairman during Watergate, and he just decided he was running for president in 1980. He ran against Reagan, Baker, Dole, a much more sort of John Connolly, a much more apparently distinguished field. Did well, ran second, became vice president, became president. Reagan goes without saying. Reagan's career is amazing. Guy's an actor, becomes a speaker, gives the famous speech for Goldwater in October '64 on national television, which the Goldwater people didn't really want him to give, but he had some backers who bought the time. Goldwater gets clobbered. What does Reagan decide? Well, I guess I should run for governor of California. Runs in the primary against the establishment choice, George Christopher, the then mayor, get this, the Republican mayor of San Francisco. It's a different state then. He was a moderate establishment Republican, very well respected. Reagan clobbers him in the primary, then beats Pat Brown, the very popular, apparently popular, governor of California, who had beaten Nixon in '62, and beats him in '66. He's governor of California, almost runs in '68 when Nixon's going to be the nominee. He's governor of California 2 years, runs against the sitting Republican president in '76, almost beats him, and comes back and runs again in '80. And I won't go back through it. Nixon himself, incredibly fast track, because runs for House seat in '46, coming out of the war, runs right away for the Senate in '50, gets himself put on the maneuvers to get put on the ticket by Eisenhower in '52, runs in '60, loses, runs for governor of California in '62. He's finished, kaput, career's over. Runs again in '68. So there is something about becoming president of the United States, if you just look at the last 7 or so that we've had, that, it rewards just kind of a certain ambition, doggedness, and willingness to just say, I don't care what everyone else says, I'm running.
Yeah, although, that's a very...
for better or worse, I'm not saying this is the best way maybe to pick leaders. It's just interesting,
That's a very interesting history, but, I'm going to dissent on one point that may surprise you. There was a famous story that when Ronald Reagan announced that he was running for governor, Jack Warner, Warner Brothers, said to a friend of his, no, that's all wrong. It's Jimmy Stewart for governor, and Ronald Reagan is his best friend. Nonetheless, I would make the case that by the time Reagan got the nomination in 1980, he was arguably the most experienced and most qualified. And I say that not only because two-term governorship of what was already the largest state in the country, but this was the third time he had run for the Republican presidential nomination. And he knew the party, he knew the lay of the land. I don't, the rap against Reagan, which was rebutted by the persona of Reagan itself, was not that he was inexperienced. It was that he was extreme and reckless.
No, I agree with that. It's just not worth getting into, but
Okay.
It's the gubernatorial race in California that's so kind of gutsy, that's impressive.
Yeah, fair enough.
And then the '76 challenge to Ford. Anyway, just whatever.
Question over here.
All right, thank you. My name is Jack Zell, and I'd like to thank you both for coming. I found the dialogue very stimulating tonight. And my question pertains to the issue of marriage equality, which has particular political saliency here at American University. And so I wanted to get your opinions on whether either candidate has the political capital or will to push this agenda item or obstruct it, and whether this item should be one I consider in how I'm voting in the next couple weeks.
Well, I think that the right stance, and Bill may agree with me on this point, is not to try to achieve a fully national solution to this issue. There is a political process that's underway in the states. And in my judgment, and I think this is Obama's judgment, it ought to be worked out through the political process on a state-by-state basis. I think that it would be a terrible thing for the country if the Supreme Court were seized of the issue and resolved it nationally, either one way or the other. And by the way, a lot of well-known leading activists for marriage equality agree with that judgment. They do not want a repetition of Roe v. Wade because the consequence of Roe v. Wade is an argument that shows no signs of ending. So, I don't think, I actually don't think that President Obama intends to do anything affirmative on the legislative front. I don't think he's telling the country that he intends to do anything affirmative on the legislative front. I think he's right not to. And I see no alternative to a state-by-state resolution. And clearly, if you are the kind of person who would like a clean national solution of this issue one way or the other, you'll not be satisfied by that stance. But I think it's the right stance for the country.
Yeah, I don't really even know what Congress could do, since I don't know that they have the legislative ability to overturn, the laws of that has been traditionally a state matter. They can do things on the margin, maybe not margin's not fair, but they can do things having to do with benefits. They have done some of those things, obviously. DOMA could get overturned by the courts, or Congress could overturn it. Congress passed it, and President Clinton signed it. So that would affect what the states have to recognize from other states. Honestly, I don't know. I do think there's a chance that an Obama-appointed Supreme Court with a friendly president behind him, and it would help maybe a friendly Senate behind him, would have more nerve to go down that path than I agree with Bill that it'll be unwise, but I'd say that just analytically they might do that. I don't think a Romney-appointed court would be likely to do it. I think with Romney you'd get pretty much the status quo, or slow developments as we've had over the last 10 years or so at the state level with some back and forth. So I don't know that. Look, and you should decide yourself what you want to vote on. I never want to tell people to vote or not, what issue they should vote on, whatever issues they feel are important. And I think you could make a case, if I were an activist in that movement, that even if Bill's right, even if I think we're both right, that the practical consequences aren't that great of which one will be president, that it would matter. Obama's for it and Romney's not, and that isn't nothing. And the kind of moral suasion, not that Obama's spoken that much about it after coming out and saying he was for it, but still, that's not nothing. And some of the judicial appointments are not nothing, and the people running different agencies isn't nothing. So I don't think it's an illegitimate issue for people on either side to weigh. Having said that, I don't think in reality necessarily you're going to get a black and white decision, as Bill said.
Thank you. Question over here.
My name is Seneca fisherman. I'm a senior in SBA. My question is, do you believe that with the increasing role of government in healthcare, do you believe that we're increasing not just quantity of Americans covered, but quality as well? And do you think this approach encourages growth in private areas such as pharmaceuticals, new technology in our medical facilities?
Well,
Big question.
a very big question, and I think that the most fervent supporters of the Affordable Care Act would acknowledge that it was more successful in universalizing health insurance coverage than it was in addressing the kinds of quality issues, and by the way, cost issues as well, that you put on the table. And I think that's true for a very simple reason. It's a lot easier to figure out how to cover people than it is to figure out how to deal with the cost and quality issues. In fairness, the Affordable Care Act includes a laundry list of every good or purportedly good idea on the quality and cost front that healthcare experts have been able to come up with over the past generation. What nobody knows is whether any one of them or all of them put together will achieve the kinds of results that you had in mind with your question. And quite frankly, I think this is an area where what Franklin Roosevelt called bold, persistent experimentation is of the essence. The healthcare system is enormously complex. Modeling how it's going to respond when you change one piece of it is extraordinarily difficult, and no healthcare expert can do it with confidence. And there's even a division of opinion as to whether this IPAB, this professional expert review board on, to approve cost-effective medical devices and treatments, will be capable of making much of a difference, even if you think it's a good idea. So the short answer to your question is nobody knows. But it's a question that we have to answer, and answer correctly sometime in the next generation, or this one activity of our government and society is going to eat everything else alive. We can't allow that to happen.
Well, I would say, though, that the Affordable Care Act does not allow all kinds of experimentation. It doesn't allow market-based experimentation. It does not allow health savings accounts. It does not allow a state to go to a system, let's say, where we could have catastrophic health insurance subsidized and available to everyone, let's say to young people in particular, and then let the market really work and stop mandating that all kinds of things be covered, including contraception, and let people decide, have real competition for kinds of plans. Let's get away from insuring everything. One of the huge problems and one of the real drivers of the bureaucratization of the system and the complexity of the system and the Rube Goldberg-ness of the system is that everything is insured, which is a crazy way to run healthcare, as it would be a crazy way to run everything else. You can have car insurance without having, every time you go to get gas or even get oil or even fix a small problem, a scratch on your car, without going to an insurance company. You could analogously, and many people do in fact, have catastrophic plans or other kinds of plans that would protect against the obvious disasters of serious illness and expensive illnesses, but encourage an awful lot of more experimentation of sort of doctors hanging out their shingle and saying they'll give you a very good checkup for $50, or they'll do other things that are appropriate. So I think I'm also for experimentation, but I think the Affordable Care Act will stall experimentation rather than encourage it.
Yeah. By the way, for the record, this is another interesting instance of potential common ground, because a couple of hours ago, I was over at the Cato Institute making the identical argument. The example that I put on the table wasn't car insurance, but home insurance, right? We don't buy insurance to cover coats of paint and routine maintenance. There is a middle ground here. There's a middle ground between catastrophe and everything. And I think we need to talk about that.
Thank you. So we have 3 people in line here. We'll take the 3 of you in turn, and that will be it.
Thanks so much. My name is Josh Jacobs. I'm a recent alumni, and I'm a part-time contributor at the Jamestown Foundation. And my question concerned democracy promotion, an issue that's very important to me, and I know you, Dr. Kristol, have written a lot about it. And my question is, Dr. Galston mentioned that we have a deficit in our foreign policy. And it seems to me that since the withdrawal from Iraq, the issue of democracy promotion is not an issue that has fallen by the wayside. You have the Arab Spring, you have our continued involvement in the Caucasus and Central Asia, and it's an issue that hasn't really come up that much, I think, in the campaign. And I wanted to ask your opinion. Do you think there is a discernible difference in how a President Romney or a President Obama would approach these issues in the next 4 years?
You want to take all 3 questions, or you want us to answer each one?
Why don't you take one at a time?
I mean, that is one of those things that's hard to say, and a lot would depend on who the Secretary of, if a President Romney made Joe Lieberman Secretary of State, which I certainly would urge him to do, I think you would have more aggressive democracy promotion than if you made Bob Zoellick, who's a perfectly able guy, but just isn't quite where Lieberman is on that issue as Secretary of State. So I think Romney will not be as evangelical about it as George W. Bush. Obama hasn't been as evangelical about it as one might have thought someone like him would be, actually. And I do think one thing I do sort of hold against the Obama administration is, for an administration that talked so much about soft power and smart power, diplomacy, and they were going to really show how you could do all these things so effectively, as opposed to that stupid Bush administration that just thought you go around bombing people. They haven't really done a very good job, in my opinion, of really overhauling the State Department, really overhauling our public diplomacy. They get spooked, they're good at, pretending some video causes riots occasionally, so they're more, Bush himself was also very careful not to offend people around the world in terms of religious belief and all that, but I actually think there's been a sort of bit of a bipartisan failure on that. But So I think Romney would be in the democracy promotion direction for a Republican. I think he's made that pretty clear. He's not going to withdraw from the world. He's not a guy who's a sort of super hard-headed realist who just will work with whatever dictators are around. If you look at the speech he gave at VMI, which is the main foreign policy speech he's given in the campaign, I would say it is, given the problematic character of how the Arab Spring is working out, he is surprisingly pro-Arab Spring and pro-democracy. I mean, he does not take cheap shots, I'll call them, that other conservatives have taken at even at Egypt, where things are problematic. And so I think he's on the democracy promotion side, given that the public is, and a lot of the elites really are pretty, at this point, have gotten a little skeptical.
Well, you asked a question I care a lot about. I'm on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, and this is a pretty important template for me. I agree with Bill. You know, I don't think, my best guess is that there's not an enormous amount to choose between them on this point. I will note for the record that being in the White House when a democracy movement is challenging an ally of 30 years who has been the linchpin of American diplomacy in the region, that is not an easy decision to make. It may seem easier in retrospect than I know it seemed at the time. And the fact that President Obama came out on what I regard as the right side of that controversy, despite some real short-term costs, tells me something, not necessarily about his gut instincts, but where cool reflection leads him on a pretty important issue. And I'm somewhat encouraged by that.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's Teddy. I'm a senior in SBA. My question has to do with, can you hear me? My question has to do with Citizens United, the Supreme Court case, and I was wondering if you guys thought it's as bad a decision as it's often made out to be, and if it is as bad a decision, what kind of solutions are available for us to kind of curb the influence of money in politics?
I mean, I'm not an expert on constitutional law. I think it seems to me a sound decision. All these attempts to curb the influence of money in politics end up getting eroded one way or the other. I mean, we can get into a complicated discussion of exactly how the structure of the current, C4s and 527s work, and whether and the limits on corporate money. But the truth is, there are an unbelievable amount of extremely wealthy people in America. They're actually divided on both sides of the political spectrum, and we do have the right of free speech. And it's pretty hard at some point to stop them from, getting their messages out one way or another. And that's what McCain-Feingold. I was a McCain supporter, so I was sympathetic to McCain-Feingold. I think it's probably a Pyrrhic attempt, and actually, this campaign has turned out, I don't think Citizens United has affected it much one way or the other. We've had huge, except that if you want to watch a baseball game in this area, you have to watch endless, even more ads about the presidential race than you would have had to 20 or 24 or 30 years ago. So, but there does seem to be sort of, equal escalation on both sides. And I don't even quite buy the argument everyone expected 6 months ago. Oh, these out of control super PACs, the ads will be incredibly nasty, so much worse than in a normal campaign. They're not, actually. They're pretty standard, pretty stupid, most of them. But I mean, it's kind of standard attack ads on both sides, I would say. And I do think this is where federalism could teach us something. I live in Virginia. We have, I believe, for state offices, no limits on contributions. I don't think we even have limits on corporate contributions, amazingly, to state candidates. And we have a pretty well-run state, and there's not more corruption in Virginia than in Maryland or other states. And we alternate between Democratic and Republican governors. And, I just think empirically it's very hard to make the case that campaign finance reform really changes either the quality of campaigns or the quality of governance that much.
Well, I'm not a constitutional lawyer either. There are people in this room who know a whole lot more about that than I do. I will say this, that I've done a lot of traveling around the country in the past year or so, talking to citizens groups, bipartisan citizens groups. And I'm left with the overwhelming impression that people in the country regard this avalanche of money as a problem that goes to the integrity of the system as a whole. Public trust in our governing institutions is at or near an all-time low, and I think one of the things that contributes to that is the sense, whether right or wrong, that our government is bought and paid for, and the people who can afford to buy it and pay for it can pay a lot more for it than ordinary folks can. And so that's troubling for democracy and for Democrats, small d. And I'm not sure what the constitutional remedy for all of this is. Bill Bradley said many years ago that the only remedy was a constitutional amendment. And in our system, that's equivalent to saying that there's no remedy.